Grace and peace to you, brothers and sisters, from God our Father and our risen Lord and Savior on this last installment for our small church worship, at least for now, at least in this format. And again, just a huge thanks to all those who have been leading, who've been hosting these spaces where we can come together and be together in worship, love each other, care for one another, pray for one another, and then just share faith and life together. They have been just amazing, enriching spaces for so many. And just a welcome again to all those who are also finding this video online at a later time. We're so glad to have you here as we dig into this word for us today from Psalm 18. And I've been thinking a lot about the gentleness here that King David offers up in the end of the chunk of this psalm that we read today. And I don't know, what is it that you think about when you think about gentleness? I know that the first thing that comes to mind for me right now is our neighbors. They had a baby this winter, and they also have a 2.5-year-old who is now a big sister and who loves her baby brother a lot, like a lot, right? And like many households who have an infant and a toddler, I've heard mom and dad say very often, "You're such a good big sister." And remember, though, that we need to love baby brother with gentleness, right? Because little people, they just love with their whole selves. And when they squeeze, they can squeeze really, really hard sometimes. Which is great, because sometimes you need a really good squeeze. When you're fragile, right, you need gentleness. Or think about the package that lands on your front doorstep, and across the top of it in big bold letters says, "Handle with care," right? It alerts us that what is inside is fragile and it needs gentleness as you take it out of the package, right? Or the white glove delivery, if you buy a new piece of furniture sometimes, that promises that they will handle your purchase and your home with gentleness. Well, in our psalm for today, King David praises God and attests that it's God's gentleness that has made him great. Think about that. God's gentleness. Now, King David was indeed a great king. Some would say that he was the greatest king that ever lived, but his life was not easy. He was the youngest of several brothers, a long line of them, and sort of forgotten, right? When Elijah comes to choose the next king from these brothers, he wasn't even brought forth as an option, as a possibility. They just left him out in the field. I don't know if they didn't think he was worthy or he was too small, right? David is the one who steps forth later, right, to slew Goliath. And they look at him and say, "You're too little, you're too young. The armor won't even fit you." It's over and over again in his life, he's just overlooked or told that he's not enough. Then King Saul, after he does slew Goliath and bring him down, right, he brings him into his home. He mentors him, takes him under his wing. He loves him like his own son, until that love turns into a seething envy and a jealousy at David's successes on the battlefield and his popularity with the people. Several times, in fact, Saul tries to have David killed, or even tries to kill him himself. So great had his contempt for him become by then. By the time King David is writing this psalm, he's battled enemies in great masses, enemies close to his heart, and enemies even from within. His own battle with ego and power and acclaim. Some have said that he was a battle-hardened soldier who'd experienced multiple close calls with death, experienced the fear and the gut ache of being on the run in a losing fight, and wrestled mightily with depression and anxiety and paranoia. Yet here he is, recounting with joy how God has been his refuge, his strength, his support, support, his empower. Despite all the enemies that he has faced, he has become the greatest of all kings. And what does David thank for his becoming great? Even more than the refuge, the strength, the empowerment, the equipping, right? He thanks and attributes God's gentleness. You know, some people are great because of their royal birth, their destiny, their heritage. Some people are great because they've been elected to great places. They have a lot of power and influence. They have a lot of wealth. Some people are great because of their victories or their sheer strength, their might. Right? Some people are great because of their discoveries, their amazing minds, and the knowledge that they have. We don't often think of someone as great because of the gentleness of God. The truth to remember here is that wherever we see evidence of greatness in the world, and in the lives of others, in ourselves, we know from David that it means that God has been there first. It is easy to underestimate the power of God's gentleness. We usually like something a little more spectacular and awesome coming from God. But true greatness comes out of having been on the receiving end, having soaked in, been made whole from the gentleness of our great God. The power in being loved so completely, so wholly and unconditionally. It's a power that brings the greatest of people to their knees, humbles the most proud, but can also close up wounds and even bring the dead to life. To be held in the palm of God's hand and receive there God's forgiveness and grace and mercy, right? To just let that wash over you. That is a power that we find nowhere else. David says, "For who is God but the Lord? And who is a rock except our God?" He holds up for us in this psalm the reality of the God of Israel against any illusions of the gods of the nations. See, in King David's time, there were many named gods that the people prayed to for answers and cures. David says they don't cut it, right? Only Yahweh, the Lord, is God. As one commentator puts it, vain were the idols of the ancient world. Baal and Jupiter, as vain as those of the modern times, right? Pleasure, honor, profit. They cannot bestow contentment or make their disciples happy below, much less can they deliver from death or open the everlasting doors above. We've just lived through a year of incredible discontent. And now the doors have been flung open. And, well, to our dismay, you can't actually snap your fingers and have everything just sort of click back into normal, like nothing ever happened. The great irony right now is that reopening, re-engaging life might be even more difficult than it was to close it all up. It brings with it questions that we've ignored for a long time and now have to face, right? How will we live this life now? What pace of this newly opened life, what pace should we take, right? Will we go back to the frantic level of activity that we knew before pandemic, or will we be more intentional about carving out space? How will we care for ourselves? Body, mind, and spirit. How will we be community together in this new time? And around all those questions swirl a myriad of emotions. Exuberance, right, of being able to hug our families, to travel, to eat in a restaurant, right, to talk to someone and see their whole face. But also there's anxiety and fear. After being in lockdown for 14 months, it's going to take some time to trust that it's safe to gather, to shop, to talk. After being isolated, being surrounded by a lot of people, right, brings a level of stimulation our brains and our bodies haven't known and aren't used to. And now that the state mandates are lifted, we are each making our own decisions about masking or not masking, distancing or not distancing, and so on. How do I make sense of your decision versus my decision so that I neither feel guilty or frustrated, right, with you or with myself? Life in many senses right now feels even more fragile than it did in March of 2020. We need to sit in the palm of God's hand. We need to just place ourselves for a bit every day in these days and just soak in God's gentleness. Allow ourselves, right, space to continue to grieve all that hasn't been, all that's been lost, and all that may not be now or ever. Allow ourselves to feel all the feels and be gentle with ourselves in all that will continue to just bubble up from deep, deep places. What I realized being together in person in worship last week was that there's a lot that I have tucked deep, deep down inside in the last 14 months. And maybe you are feeling some of that as well. And now that space is opening up and we are encountering one another, all that emotion is opening up and we're having to come face to face, not only with each other, but with that emotion too. As we just sit in God's holy presence and allow God's gentleness to wash over us, might it also teach us how to be gentle with ourselves and with one another in these days. Another great commentator says, while it was the gentleness God exercised that allowed David his success, it was the gentleness God taught him that was his true greatness. We are invited into relationship with the living God who shelters us in holy wings, right? Under holy wings of grace and mercy and gentleness. We are forgiven there. We are healed. We are made whole in the space of God's loving embrace. And as we heal, we are shown how to live that gentleness out in the world. Philippians 4:5 says, let your gentleness be evident to all. Of all the things that Paul might list in his letter to the Philippians, right? He says, let your gentleness be what is evident to all. And the next sentence is, the Lord is near, right? For the Lord is near. When the Lord is near, we receive that gift of God's gentleness and grace, that grace and that gentleness might be evident in our lives to those around us. And that is my prayer for us this week. Right? Tomorrow is Memorial Day, a day when we pause as a country to give thanks for all of those who have won and ensured that we are a free country, that we have the ability to carve out space in our lives. Let's use that to sit in God's gentleness on our own and with one another. My prayer is that you would experience this week the incredible gentleness of God in this strange time that we are in. It's kind of an in-between time, a back to normal that isn't what we've known as normal and probably isn't what new normal is ultimately going to be. And then that we would learn that gentleness, that we might share it when we are face to face, when we can talk and see our whole faces, or not, depending on where we're at, but that we might be gentle with one another in those times. And to give you some space for that today, Jennifer has put together an arrangement of Thy Holy Wings, a beautiful hymn that in her words is one giant musical exhale, right? Just this moment to let our shoulders down, to enter into a space where we can feel some of the feels and be gentle and experience God's gentleness for us. This is largely instrumental, and although she does sing one verse, it's meant to be meditative. So I just invite you to get comfortable. You might even close your eyes if you want to. Just place yourself in the palm of God's hands and find rest and peace under holy wings. Amen.